The unexpected collision. The small, desolate planet of Sci-Fi was quiet. Its pale, rocky surface stretched as far as the eye could see, covered with dry soil and a few scattered hills. Ethan, a young human guard, stood at his post, looking through his telescope. He was stationed here on a simple mission, to monitor the planet's surface for any unusual activity. It was a lonely job, but Ethan had no complaints. The routine gave him peace, away from the chaos of the galaxy. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the barren land, Ethan noticed something strange. A bright light appeared in the sky, moving fast. His eyes widened in shock. It wasn't a star, nor was it an asteroid. This was something different. The object was growing larger, crashing toward the surface. The sky was filled with a trail of smoke and fire as the object barreled through the atmosphere. "Is it a spaceship?" Ethan muttered to himself, his heart pounding in his chest. He quickly grabbed his equipment and sprinted toward the location of the crash. His boots kicked up dust as he ran through the rocky terrain, feeling the adrenaline rushing through his veins. Whatever it was big, and it was coming fast. Ethan had never seen anything like this before. When he finally arrived at the crash site, he couldn't believe his eyes. A massive spacecraft lay partially buried in the ground, smoke rising from its shattered exterior. The ship's dark metal gleamed in the fading light of the sun, its surface scratched and scorched. Ethan hesitated, wondering if anyone had survived. His training told him to call for backup, but his curiosity got the best of him. What if there was someone, or something, inside? Cautiously, he approached the wreckage, scanning the area for any signs of life. The ship's outer hull was mangled, twisted beyond recognition. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he heard a faint sound coming from within. It was a soft, muffled voice. Someone was alive. Without wasting another moment, he climbed over the twisted metal and entered the wreck. The air inside was thick with smoke, making it hard to breathe. Ethan's eyes stung, but he pushed forward, determined to find the survivor. As he moved deeper into the ship, he heard the voice again. It was weak, almost desperate. Ethan's heart raced as he reached a small compartment near the ship's center. Inside, amidst the wreckage, lay a figure, a woman. But she was unlike any human he had ever seen. She had smooth, pale skin that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Her long, silvery hair spread out like a halo around her head. She wore a strange, regal outfit, unlike anything from Earth. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the truth. She wasn't human. Who are you?" Ethan asked, his voice shaky. The woman's eyes fluttered open, revealing bright, glowing irises that seemed to pierce through the darkness. She stared at Ethan for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, in a voice that sounded both soft and commanding, she spoke. "I am Lyra, Princess of the Zinthar Empire." Ethan froze. He had heard of the Zinthar Empire before. They were a powerful alien race, known for their advanced technology and mysterious ways. But what was a princess from such a civilization doing on a backwater planet like Sci-Fi? "Princess," Ethan repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. "What happened? How did you crash here?" Lyra struggled to sit up, her face grim. "Our ship was attacked by enemies. We were forced to flee, but something went wrong. The ship was damaged, and we were forced to make an emergency landing." Ethan's mind raced. If Lyra's story was true, then she was not just any survivor. She was important. This wasn't just an accident. The Zinthar Empire was a major player in galactic politics, and if word got out that their princess had crashed on a remote planet, it could have serious consequences. But Ethan wasn't sure who to trust. He had been trained to view aliens like Lyra as a potential threat. "Are you alone?" Ethan asked, his hand hovering near the weapon strapped to his side. Lyra nodded slowly. "Yes, I am the only one who survived." Ethan looked around, his mind racing. He had no idea what to do next. Should he help her? Or should he report this immediately to his superiors? His training told him to be cautious, but Lyra's eyes, full of pain and vulnerability, made it hard to turn away. As Ethan pondered his next move, he heard a distant rumble. The ground beneath him trembled slightly, and the sound of something moving in the distance grew louder. He turned quickly, looking for the source of the noise. Was it another spaceship, or something far worse? "Listen," Ethan said urgently, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We need to move. Something's coming." Lyra looked confused, but she didn't hesitate. With Ethan's help, she struggled to stand, leaning on him for support. The princess was injured, but she was still strong. They had no time to waste. Ethan knew that whatever was coming, they had to get to safety, and fast. As they made their way out of the wreckage, the noise grew louder, closer. Ethan's heart beat faster. What were they up against? Who, or what, was out there? Whatever it was, they didn't have much time. He glanced at Lyra. She was looking at him, her glowing eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. It was only the beginning of a journey neither of them could have imagined. They were trapped together on a planet no one cared about, with unknown dangers lurking around every corner. But one thing was clear. Their fates were now intertwined. And in this strange, dangerous place, they would need to trust each other to survive. The adventure had only just begun. A moment of conflict. The sun had nearly set on Sci-Fi, casting long shadows across the barren landscape as Ethan and Lyra made their way away from the wrecked ship. The air had grown colder, and the planet's strange winds began to stir, blowing dust and sand across the rocky terrain. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken questions and distrust. They walked side by side, but neither one of them dared to look at the other. Ethan's mind was racing, trying to process everything that had just happened. An alien princess, a shipwreck. What did all this mean for him, for the galaxy, and for the mission he had been assigned to? He glanced sideways at Lyra. She was tall and graceful, her pale skin glowing faintly in the twilight. Her silvery hair shimmered with every movement, and despite the obvious exhaustion in her posture, there was a certain regal elegance in the way she carried herself. But beneath that poise, there was something else, a sadness, a weariness that spoke of a world far removed from his own. "Where are we going?" Lyra's voice broke the silence, soft yet commanding. "Is there somewhere we can find shelter?" Ethan hesitated. He had no idea where to go. He was supposed to monitor the planet's surface for possible threats, not be caught in a situation like this. But the princess was injured, and they couldn't stay near the crash site. Whoever, or whatever, was coming for them, he needed to get them both to safety. "I know a place," Ethan said finally, his voice rough. "There's an old research station not far from here. It's abandoned, but it should be safe for the time being." Lyra nodded, though she didn't seem entirely convinced. They continued walking in silence, the only sound being the crunch of their boots on the dry soil. Ethan felt a strange tension in the air between them, a feeling that only grew as the minutes passed. He knew he couldn't trust her completely. After all, she was a member of the Zinthar Empire, the very empire his people had been at war with for years. He had been trained to view them as enemies, dangerous and unpredictable. Yet here she was, a survivor of a crash, vulnerable and in need of help. His training and instincts told him to stay distant, to be on guard. But something about her presence made it difficult to maintain that cold distance. She wasn't what he had expected. Despite being a princess, she seemed human in a way. Her eyes, filled with quiet sorrow, made him wonder about the life she had left behind. As they walked, Ethan stole a glance at her again. She was watching him now, her glowing eyes studying him intently. There was no anger in her gaze, no malice, just an almost piercing curiosity. It made him feel uneasy. He had never been in a situation like this before, and he didn't know how to act around her. "What will happen now?" Lyra asked after a moment, her voice hesitant. "What will your people do when they find out I'm here?" Ethan gritted his teeth. He wasn't ready to have that conversation. His mind was already spinning with thoughts of what would happen if word of her survival reached the higher-ups. The Zinthar Empire was powerful, and their political and military influence could have consequences for the entire galaxy. He didn't know if he could trust her words. "We'll deal with that when the time comes," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Right now, we need to focus on getting to safety." Lyra seemed to accept that answer, though her expression remained unreadable. They continued walking, but the tension between them remained thick and uncomfortable. Ethan could feel it. His guard was still up, but so was hers. It was as though they were both waiting for the other to make a move, to reveal their true intentions. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled, and the sound of something heavy crashing against the earth filled the air. Ethan's heart leaped into his throat. He spun around, scanning the horizon, but saw nothing. "What was that?" Lyra asked, her voice rising with panic. Ethan cursed under his breath. Something was coming. Something big, and it was heading straight for them. The rumbling grew louder, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Whatever it was getting closer and fast. "We need to move," Ethan said, his voice firm. Without waiting for a response, he grabbed Lyra's arm and pulled her forward, urging her to run. She stumbled at first, but quickly caught up to him, her feet moving faster than he had expected. It was as though she had more strength than she had let on. They ran, pushing their bodies through the wind and dust, the distant sound of the approaching threat growing louder with each passing second. Ethan didn't know what it was, but he could feel the danger closing in. His mind raced, calculating their options. There were few places to hide on Sci-Fi. The landscape was harsh, barren, and unforgiving. The research station was their only real chance. "Keep up," Ethan shouted, glancing over at Lyra. "We're almost there." They ran for what felt like hours, but in reality, it was only minutes. The research station was in sight, a rusted building half buried in the sand. Ethan could see the entrance up ahead, and he pushed forward, praying they would make it in time. As they reached the door, Ethan shoved it open, and they both hurried inside. The station was dark, the air stale and thick with the scent of decay. But it was shelter, at least for now. Ethan slammed the door shut behind them, locking it quickly. He leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. His heart was still racing. Lyra, too, was breathing heavily, her body trembling with exertion. "What was that?" she asked again, her voice now full of fear. "What's after us?" Ethan didn't know the answer. All he knew was that they weren't safe yet. Whatever was hunting them was still out there. But one thing was clear: trust, or the lack of it, would be their greatest challenge in the days to come. The walls of the research station weren't enough to protect them from the dangers of this strange planet. And the secrets they both carried, secrets of war, survival, and what it meant to be enemies, would only grow darker as their paths collided further. They were trapped, and what happened next would determine whether they survived, or became just another forgotten story on a desolate world. Unlikely teamwork. The cold walls of the research station felt suffocating as the wind howled outside, rattling the thin metal structure. Ethan and Lyra stood in the dim light of the main room, the sound of their heavy breathing filling the air. The brief moment of respite had passed, and the reality of their situation began to set in. They were alone on an alien planet, with nothing but each other for company, and whatever danger had been following them still out there, waiting. Ethan paced the room, his mind working quickly. The research station was old, its equipment outdated and mostly useless, but it was the only shelter they had. His eyes darted over the worn machinery, hoping to find something that could help them. Lyra, on the other hand, had collapsed onto a dusty bench, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. She had been through a crash, and whatever had attacked her ship still haunted her. "How long do you think we have?" Ethan asked, his voice low, trying to ignore the growing tension between them. He wanted answers. He needed to know more about Lyra's people, about why she was here. and about the nature of the threat that was hunting them both. Lyra looked up at him, her glowing eyes filled with an emotion Ethan couldn't place. Something between sadness and determination. "I don't know," she said quietly, "but we don't have much time. We need to repair the ship's communicator if we want to call for help." Her voice was steady, but Ethan could hear the weight of worry in her tone. "Communicator," Ethan repeated, his brow furrowing. "You expect me to help you fix that thing? We're on a planet with nothing but dust and ruins, and you want to repair a broken communicator?" Lyra's gaze didn't falter. "I know it sounds impossible," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But I can help you. I have the knowledge, and you have the skills. We can work together." Ethan hesitated, the words lingering in the air. He had never worked with an alien before, let alone one from the Zinthar Empire. His training had taught him to view them as enemies, dangerous, unpredictable, and driven by motives he could never understand. But Lyra's calm demeanor and the raw vulnerability she had shown since the crash made him second-guess everything he thought he knew. "Why should I trust you?" Ethan asked, his voice gruff, though he knew the question was pointless. He was already past the point of no return. He had to decide whether to help her or leave her to her fate. If he left her, what would that make him? A coward, a traitor to his own humanity. Lyra didn't flinch at his question. She simply met his gaze, her voice steady. "Because you have no choice." Her words struck him harder than he expected. Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, a loud crash outside made him freeze. The ground trembled again, more violently than before. He rushed to the window, peering through the cracked glass. In the distance, he saw shadows moving, large shapes, too many to count. Whatever it was close, and it wasn't going away. "We don't have time to argue," Lyra said, standing up from the bench. She was already moving toward the damaged equipment, her determination palpable. "Help me get that communicator working. If we don't, we'll be left to face whatever's out there alone." Ethan watched her for a moment. The storm was closing in, and the threat outside was growing more real by the second. The communicator was their only hope. Whether or not he trusted Lyra didn't matter. If they wanted to survive, they needed to put their differences aside and work together. He sighed and moved toward the workbench. The old research station had a few tools scattered around, some of them useful, most of them outdated. But as he scanned the pieces of equipment, he realized that with a little ingenuity, they could fix the broken device. He had experience with repairing communication equipment, but it would be difficult with the limited resources available. Still, it was their best shot. As Ethan worked, Lyra stood nearby, her hands moving with surprising speed and precision. She had removed a small panel from the communicator and was now inspecting the wiring inside. Her eyes glowed with a faint blue light as she studied the components, clearly using some sort of alien technology to assist her. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked, glancing up from his work. Lyra didn't look at him. "I'm using my knowledge to rewire the internal power core. I can't fix everything, but I can help with the most important parts." Ethan's hands paused as he watched her. He was amazed at how quickly she worked, how she seemed to understand the technology with such ease. This was no ordinary princess. She was more than just royalty. She had an intellect, a skill set that most people could only dream of. "Impressive," Ethan muttered, more to himself than to her. "I didn't expect that from a princess." Lyra finally turned her head to meet his gaze, a hint of a smile on her lips. "I'm more than just a princess," she said softly. "I was trained to lead, to think strategically, and to understand the technology of my people. The Zinthar Empire is not what your people believe it to be." Ethan didn't respond right away. He had heard stories of the Zinthar Empire, stories of power, control, and ruthless leaders. But Lyra didn't fit the image of the cold, calculating princess he had imagined. There was warmth in her voice, a gentleness that seemed out of place for someone of her status. It made him question everything he had been taught. For the first time since their crash, Ethan began to wonder if he had been wrong about her. Maybe their enemies weren't as simple as he had thought. Maybe the lines between right and wrong weren't so clear-cut. As they worked side by side, the minutes turned into hours. The storm outside raged, and the pressure of their situation weighed heavily on them. But the closer they got to repairing the communicator, the more Ethan realized something. Despite everything, despite their differences, their mistrust, and the strange circumstances that had brought them together, he was starting to rely on Lyra. She wasn't just a princess. She wasn't just an enemy. She was a partner in their survival, and that realization changed everything. "We're almost there," Ethan said, glancing at Lyra. "Just a little more work, and we can call for help." Lyra nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "We can do this, Ethan. Together." And for the first time since their fateful encounter, Ethan believed her. The storm outside raged on, but inside the research station, something shifted. The tension between them had not disappeared, but it had lessened. They were no longer strangers. They were allies, bound together by necessity, and for better or worse, trust. They had a chance. But as the storm howled outside, neither of them could shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, Ethan felt a small glimmer of hope. A hidden danger. The night on Sci-Fi was unlike anything Ethan had ever experienced. The stars were distant pinpricks in the sky, and the planet's 2 moons hung low, casting an eerie, pale light over the barren landscape. Inside the research station, the glow of the dim emergency lights was the only source of illumination, flickering occasionally as if struggling to stay on. The hum of the old generator was the only sound that filled the silence, except for the occasional rustle of dust carried by the winds outside. Ethan stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the storm that had been growing more intense as the hours passed. The wind had turned violent, howling through the cracks in the walls, pushing sand and debris against the building. It was as if the planet itself was angry, alive, and waiting for something. His fingers drummed nervously on the windowsill, his mind racing. They had managed to repair the communicator, but the signal had yet to go through. They had no way of knowing if the call would reach anyone, let alone whether help would arrive in time. Behind him, Lyra was working at a table, her fingers moving quickly over the components of the communicator. Her concentration was absolute, but the fatigue in her eyes was clear. The crash had taken its toll on her, yet she continued working tirelessly, determined to make it work, to make sure they weren't left stranded on this hostile planet. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had heard no more noises from outside, but that didn't put him at ease. The silence felt unnatural, oppressive, and it was then that he heard it. A faint sound at first, barely perceptible. A low growl, almost a rumble, but it was enough to make his heart skip a beat. His head snapped toward the door. Lyra looked up, her eyes narrowing in curiosity. She must have heard it too. Ethan motioned for her to stay quiet, his instincts kicking in. Slowly, he crept to the door and pressed his ear against it. The growl was getting louder, closer now, and it wasn't alone. There were more sounds, a rustling, a scraping noise like claws against metal. "Something's out there," Ethan whispered, his voice tense. Lyra didn't need any more explanation. She stood up, her movements swift and graceful despite her injuries. She walked toward the back of the room where a few basic weapons were stored, tools the previous research team had left behind. She picked up a small energy rifle, checking it quickly. "We're not alone," she said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "Whatever it is, it's coming closer." Ethan's pulse quickened. His hand instinctively went to his sidearm, the familiar weight of it grounding him. He knew he had to protect Lyra. Whether or not they were allies didn't matter at this moment. There was a threat outside, and he wasn't going to let her fall prey to it. Not while he could do something about it. The growling intensified, followed by another noise, louder this time, a sharp screech that made Ethan's blood run cold. It was close. Too close. "I'm going to scout the perimeter," Ethan said quickly. "Stay here and keep the communicator powered on. If help arrives, we need to be ready." Lyra hesitated, her glowing eyes locking onto his. "And if we're not lucky enough to get help?" she asked, her voice low but tinged with fear. Ethan didn't answer right away. The idea of fighting whatever was out there alone was not one he wanted to entertain, but he didn't have a choice. He couldn't afford to let fear take hold now. "I'll keep you safe," he said simply, though even he wasn't sure if those words were enough. With that, he opened the door slowly, the metal creaking as it moved. A blast of cold wind hit him, stinging his skin, but he pushed through it. The storm outside was fierce, but it didn't obscure his vision entirely. He could make out shapes in the distance, dark shadows that moved with purpose. The growling sound grew louder, more distinct. Ethan's eyes narrowed. He couldn't see exactly what was making the noise, but he could hear it. Whatever they were big. And they weren't friendly. As he stepped farther into the storm, he scanned the landscape. The wind whipped around him, and the dust clouded his vision. But then, through the haze, he saw something that made his heart stop. A massive, hulking figure emerging from the shadows. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its large, muscular frame was covered in thick, scaly armor. A predator, far more dangerous than any animal Ethan had encountered in his training. And it wasn't alone. Two more figures appeared beside it, smaller but just as menacing. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if they were stalking their prey. Ethan's grip tightened around his sidearm. His instincts screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The research station was their only shelter. He had to act fast. He slowly backed toward the station, making sure not to make any sudden movements that might alert the creatures to his presence. But they were already aware of him. One of the creatures, much larger than the others, let out a deafening roar, its massive claws scraping the ground as it began to charge toward him. Without thinking, Ethan fired. The blast struck the creature in the chest, sending it stumbling backward. But it didn't fall. It roared again, more enraged than before, and Ethan knew they were in trouble. The creature's hide was thick, and the weapon wasn't enough to bring it down. "Lyra!" Ethan shouted over his shoulder. "Get ready." He dove back into the station, slamming the door shut behind him. His pulse was racing, and his breath came in short bursts. He turned to Lyra, who was already waiting by the communicator, her rifle aimed at the door. "We have to hold them off," Ethan said, his voice strained. "We don't have much time." Lyra nodded, her face set in determination. "I'll make sure we can contact help. You just keep them away from here." Outside, the creatures were closing in, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. Ethan could hear their claws scraping against the ground, their growls sending chills down his spine. There was no more time for second thoughts. He took a deep breath and moved toward the door, preparing for the fight of his life. As the first creature slammed against the door, Ethan braced himself. He couldn't help but wonder, was this the real reason they had been sent to this planet? Was this the hidden danger he hadn't been trained for? Whatever the answers were, one thing was clear. He and Lyra had to survive. There was no turning back now. Learning the truth. The research station was eerily quiet now, the only sound coming from the distant howls of the storm outside and the faint hum of the failing generator. The aftermath of the attack left the building rattling, the walls now marked with scratches from the creature's claws. Ethan's heart still pounded in his chest, adrenaline still flowing through him from the close call. But even with the immediate threat of the creatures temporarily pushed back, there was no time to rest. Every minute counted. Ethan glanced at Lyra, who stood beside the damaged communicator, her face still set in grim determination. She hadn't flinched during the attack, her presence steady and calm even when the creatures had been just outside the door. Her ability to stay composed in such a dire situation was both impressive and unsettling. Ethan's mind raced, wondering what kind of leader she was, how she was able to stay so focused. But more than that, he couldn't shake the questions that had been haunting him since their crash. "Lyra," he began, his voice softer now than it had been during the chaos. "I need to know more about you, about your people. Why were you on this planet? Why is everything happening the way it is? I don't understand. There's so much you haven't told me." She didn't turn to him immediately. Her fingers brushed over the components of the communicator, her mind seemingly still focused on the task at hand. But after a moment of silence, she finally spoke, her voice calm yet filled with an emotion Ethan couldn't quite place. "I knew you would ask," she said quietly, "and I know I've been avoiding telling you the truth. But we don't have much time, and you deserve to know." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He had been expecting this moment, but now that it was here, he felt the weight of it, the gravity of what Lyra was about to reveal. He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving her. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about understanding who they were, why they were here, and how their fates had become intertwined. Lyra took a deep breath and turned to face him. Her eyes shimmered in the low light, filled with an ancient sorrow and wisdom that far exceeded her years. "You see," she began, "the Zinthar Empire is not just a group of conquerors, as your people have been led to believe. It is a complex civilization, one that has spent centuries striving to maintain peace across the galaxy. My role as a princess was never to rule with an iron fist. My mission, Ethan, was to prevent war. I came here to broker a treaty, to negotiate peace between the Zinthar and your people, the humans." Ethan blinked in disbelief. He had been trained to see the Zinthar as cold, calculating, and aggressive. The stories of their empire's expansion, of their ruthless conquests, had shaped every opinion he had formed about them. But here Lyra was, telling him that everything he had been taught could be wrong. "Wait," Ethan interrupted, his mind spinning. "You came here to make peace. Why didn't you tell me this earlier? I've spent my whole life believing your people were the enemy, that you wanted nothing but domination." His voice had a hint of frustration, the anger he had bottled up threatening to surface. Lyra lowered her gaze, her eyes momentarily distant. "I know what you've been told," she said softly. "The Zinthar are a proud empire, and not all of us have agreed on how to achieve peace. Some of our leaders, those in power, believe that the only way to maintain control is through fear and force. But there are others, like me, who believe that we can find a way to coexist. I came here with a group of diplomats, hoping to bring your people to the negotiating table." Ethan was silent for a long moment, his mind processing her words. He had always thought of the Zinthar Empire as a single monolithic force, a threat to humanity, a looming power they had to prepare for. But now, Lyra was showing him a different side, a side he had never considered. Her words planted a seed of doubt in his mind, making him question everything he had been taught, everything he had believed. "But the crash," Ethan said slowly. "What happened? Was it an accident, or did someone do this to you?" Lyra clenched her fists, her face tightening with anger. "It wasn't an accident," she said, her voice hardening. "We were ambushed. My ship was attacked by a faction of the Zinthar military, those loyal to the old ways, the ones who think the galaxy should be ruled by force. They saw my mission as a threat to their power, and they sabotaged my ship, forcing me to crash here. They don't want peace. They want to keep the galaxy in chaos, and they will stop at nothing to ensure that peace never happens." Ethan's mind reeled. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The Zinthar military, those same soldiers who had always been painted as the enemies of humanity, were responsible for the crash. They had tried to kill Lyra, one of their own. "Why would they target you?" Ethan asked, the words coming out more harshly than he intended. "You're the princess. You're one of their own people." "Because I'm a threat to everything they stand for," Lyra replied quietly. "I was never meant to inherit the throne, not in the way they wanted. I wasn't raised to rule with violence, to dominate the galaxy. My mission was to find common ground, to end the bloodshed. and they feared that. They feared that if peace prevailed, their power would be diminished. Ethan stood there, staring at her, his mind in a whirl. He had never imagined this, never once considered the possibility that the Zynthar might not be a single, unified force of evil. Lyra's words made him question everything he had been taught, everything he had known. He had been told that war was inevitable, that humanity had to defend itself against an empire that would never negotiate. But now, in front of him, was a princess, a living, breathing example of a different kind of leadership. "What does this mean for us?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. "If we contact your people, what will happen?" Lyra hesitated. "It's not just my people I'm worried about," she said quietly. "It's the forces that are hunting us. If they find us before we can reach out to my allies, they will destroy us both. They won't stop until they silence anyone who stands in their way." Ethan felt a chill run through him. He had known the dangers on this planet were real, but this was something entirely different. They weren't just fighting for survival against the creatures outside. They were caught in a larger, more dangerous game, one that could determine the fate of the entire galaxy. Lyra stepped closer, her eyes meeting his. "We don't have much time, Ethan. If we can reach my allies, we can stop this war, but we have to trust each other. We have to fight together." Ethan swallowed hard. In that moment, he realized that their fates were no longer just tied to the storm outside or the creatures that lurked in the shadows. They were tied to something much larger, and the decisions they made now could change the course of history, if they survived long enough to see it unfold. He nodded slowly. "Together, then." And just like that, the fragile alliance between them was solidified. The storm outside wasn't the only thing they had to face. There were far darker forces at work, and the battle was only beginning. The escape plan. The wind outside howled like a wild animal, tearing at the metal walls of the research station. Ethan stood near the entrance, peering out through a small window, his eyes scanning the dark landscape beyond. The storm raged outside, a swirling vortex of sand and debris, making it almost impossible to see anything more than a few feet ahead. His breath fogged up the glass, and he wiped it away with the back of his hand. But despite the chaos of the storm, there was no mistaking it. The creatures were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. Inside the research station, Lyra worked furiously on the communicator, her fingers moving rapidly over the wires and panels. The damaged device flickered in front of her, emitting a soft hum as she connected various components with expert precision. Sweat glistened on her brow, her concentration unwavering despite the growing pressure. Ethan could see the exhaustion in her posture, her back slightly hunched, her movements deliberate but strained. But she never paused in her work. "We're running out of time," Ethan said, his voice tense. "If we don't contact your people soon, we're not going to make it out of here." Lyra didn't respond right away, but Ethan could see the determination in her eyes. She was pushing herself harder than he had ever seen anyone work. She understood the gravity of their situation. "I know," she said quietly, without looking up. "But I need a few more minutes. This communicator was built to withstand a lot, but the damage is extensive. I can't just bypass the system. It's too complicated. We need it to be stable, or it won't reach anyone." Ethan nodded, his gaze drifting back to the outside world. The creatures hadn't made another attempt to break through the door, but he knew that wouldn't last forever. They were patient, cunning, and relentless. He couldn't afford to stand here and wait. Every passing minute brought them closer to danger. Ethan's thoughts turned to the escape plan. He had formulated one in his mind, one that would give them a fighting chance to get off this planet. But it was risky, and it depended on a lot of things going right. He needed to act fast, to create a window of opportunity for both of them. The storm outside was their biggest enemy right now. It made it nearly impossible to move without being detected, but it also provided cover. If they played it right, the storm could help them get close to the shipwreck before the creatures realized what they were doing. "We're going to have to make a run for it," Ethan said, turning back toward Lyra. She paused, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean?" "The ship," he explained. "The wreckage is our only chance of getting off this planet. If I can get to it, I can send a distress signal, but we'll need to move fast. We can't stay here and wait for them to find us." Lyra took a deep breath, her fingers still working the communicator, but her expression now more focused. "You're right," she said. "We can't stay here. But the creatures, they'll be watching. We can't afford to be seen." Ethan looked out the window again, searching the horizon for any sign of movement. The storm made the landscape look like a ghost town, barren and lifeless. But deep down, he knew the creatures were out there, waiting, stalking, hunting. They were too close for comfort. "The storm gives us some cover," Ethan said. "It'll hide our movements for a while, but only if we stay low and move fast. We'll need to get to the wreckage, repair the transmitter, and signal for help. But that's only half the battle." He turned back to Lyra, his eyes locking with hers. "I can't do this without you. I need you to stay focused. I need you to keep working on that communicator while I try to hold them off. If we can get that distress signal out, we have a chance, but we need to work together. No mistakes." Lyra didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She nodded, her face determined, the weight of the situation now fully understood. "I'm with you," she said. "I'll finish the communicator. You focus on getting us to the ship." Ethan's heart raced. He had made a promise to protect her, to get them both off this planet. But he couldn't afford to let his emotions cloud his judgment now. He had to be tactical, calculating, and most importantly, fast. "The wreckage is about half a mile from here," Ethan said. "We'll need to be careful. The creatures are fast, and they're smart. We can't risk being spotted. There's an old cave system a few hundred yards from the wreck. If we can get there, we can make our way around undetected." Lyra was already moving, pulling tools and equipment from the crates in the corner of the room. She worked swiftly, knowing that the clock was ticking down. Ethan knew he needed to give her the space he needed to finish the repairs on the communicator while he set up the escape plan. "You'll need to use the cave to circle around behind a wreck," Ethan continued, his mind already racing through the details. "I'll take the longer route and try to create a distraction. We'll meet at the wreck and make the signal. Once that's done, we'll move to the extraction point." Lyra looked up at him. "And if the creatures follow us, what then?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then we fight. But we don't stop moving. The longer we stay in one place, the more chance they have of catching us. If we keep moving, we'll stay one step ahead." She nodded again, her eyes flashing with understanding. "Understood." Ethan took a deep breath, steeling himself for the path ahead. He wasn't afraid of the creatures. He'd faced worse. But this was different. They were outnumbered, and the storm gave the creatures an advantage. They knew the land better than he did, and they would be able to track them if they weren't careful. But there was no time to waste. They couldn't afford to wait for a perfect plan. They had to act now. He glanced at Lyra one last time before heading toward the door. "Stay low, stay quiet, and don't stop until you reach the wreck." Lyra's eyes met his. "We'll make it," she said, her voice steady. With a final nod, Ethan opened the door and stepped outside into the chaos of the storm. The wind slacked against his face, and the sand stung his eyes. But he ignored it. The creatures were still out there, waiting. But so was their chance of survival. They just had to make it through the storm. And that would be the first step. Ethan moved forward, crouching low, blending into the howling storm. As he disappeared into the darkness, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him. But one thing was clear. This was their only shot. There would be no second chances. It was now or never. The countdown had begun. The final test. The storm had reached its peak by the time Ethan and Lyra were on their final approach to the wreckage. The sky was a swirling mass of dark clouds and flashing streaks of lightning, with the wind howling like a furious beast. The air was thick with dust and sand, the world around them a hazy blur. Yet through it all, Ethan remained focused, his mind sharp and alert. There was no turning back now. Ethan crouched low against a jagged rock, using the swirling winds as cover as he scanned the horizon. He had taken the longer route, moving around the edge of the wreckage to avoid the creatures that might be hunting them. He could hear them out there, their low growls, the distant sound of heavy footsteps in the sand. They were close, too close for comfort, but they hadn't spotted him yet. He needed to reach the wreckage undetected. Behind him, Lyra moved with swift, quiet precision, her form barely visible in the storm. She was using the cave system to move around the other side of the wreckage, where she would hopefully be able to reach the communication terminal and send out the distress signal. Ethan didn't like the idea of splitting up, but it was the only way. They had to cover as much ground as possible and create a distraction, anything to give them the upper hand. Ethan pressed his hand to his ear, activating the small communicator attached to his belt. "Lyra, report in," he whispered, his voice low and tense. There was a brief pause before her voice crackled through the device, faint but clear. "I'm almost there," she said. "The creatures are still following the storm's path. They're not paying attention to me for now." Ethan exhaled, relief flooding through him. She was making good progress, but they still had a long way to go. The creatures could change direction at any moment, and once they spotted one of them, it would be too late. They would need to move fast, and they couldn't afford to waste any time. "Keep your distance," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. "I'll be at the wreckage in a few minutes. Once you're in position, I'll make my move. We don't have much time before they find us." "I understand," Lyra replied. "I'll stay out of sight until you give the signal." Ethan adjusted his grip on his sidearm, taking a deep breath. He knew that this would be the most dangerous part of their plan. They were running out of time, and everything depended on them reaching the wreckage, repairing the transmitter, and sending out the distress signal. If the creatures found them before then, it would be over. The wind gusted harder, and sand stung Ethan's face as he continued toward the wreck. He was nearly there, just a few more meters, and he would be at the wreckage. His heart was pounding, adrenaline rushing through his veins, but he couldn't afford to let fear take hold. If they failed now, they would be trapped on this planet with no way out. There would be no rescue, no hope. The stakes were too high. As he approached the wreckage, Ethan slowed his pace, keeping low to the ground. His eyes darted around, scanning the area for any movement. The ship's twisted metal frame loomed ahead of him, dark and foreboding against the storm's backdrop. He could make out the shape of the communicator near the center of the wreck. If they could get to it, they could send the signal. But as he crept closer, a sudden rustle of movement caught his attention. Ethan froze, his hand tightening around his weapon. Through the swirling dust, he saw the silhouette of one of the creatures, its yellow eyes glowing eerily in the darkness. It was standing guard near the wreckage, its massive form silhouetted against the flashing lightning. Ethan held his breath. If the creature spotted him, their entire plan would be ruined. Slowly, he backed away, taking cover behind a large rock, his heart pounding in his chest. He watched as the creature sniffed the air, its head swiveling from side to side, clearly searching for something. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to move, to run, but he knew that would be a mistake. The creature would surely chase him down, and there would be no escaping it. He waited, silent and still, his eyes locked on the creature. His mind raced. If it was the only one guarding the wreck, he could take it out quickly, but he couldn't risk alerting the others. The slightest mistake would cost them everything. Suddenly, the creature let out a low growl, its eyes narrowing. It had picked up a scent, Ethan's scent. He cursed under his breath, knowing that he had only seconds to act. He needed to create a diversion. Without thinking twice, he drew his weapon and fired into the air, the blast echoing through the storm. The creature jerked, its head snapping toward the sound. For a split second, Ethan saw the opportunity he needed. The creature was distracted, momentarily disoriented by the shot. Ethan didn't waste any time. He sprinted toward the wreckage, using the storm's chaos to cover his movements. The creature roared in anger, its yellow eyes burning with fury as it charged after him. Ethan's heart raced, but he didn't look back. He could hear the heavy footsteps behind him, growing closer with every second. He dove for the wreckage, scrambling toward the communication terminal, praying that Lyra had already finished her part. As he reached the terminal, he found Lyra waiting, her hands already on the device. "I've got it," she said, her voice urgent. "It's almost ready. I just need a few more seconds." Ethan barely had time to take a breath before the creature was upon him, its massive form crashing into the wreckage with a force that made the ground shake. The beast's claws scraped across the metal, and Ethan rolled to the side just in time, narrowly avoiding the creature's attack. He fired a shot at the creature's face, but it only staggered back for a moment before charging again. Lyra was working as fast as she could, her eyes darting between the terminal and Ethan, who was now facing off with the enraged creature. Ethan fired again, this time hitting the creature in its leg. It roared in pain, stumbling back, but it was far from done. Ethan needed to keep it distracted, just long enough for Lyra to send the signal. "Almost there," Lyra called out. Ethan gritted his teeth, his body aching from the adrenaline and the intensity of the fight. He could feel the creature closing in again, but just as it lunged at him, he heard the unmistakable sound of the communicator's signal coming to life. The transmission was going through. The creature screeched, but its sound was drowned out by the static of the communicator. Ethan could hear the crackling of the transmission, the faint voice on the other end. "Ethan, Lyra, this is Commander Havel. We've got your signal. Hold tight. Reinforcements are on the way." Relief washed over Ethan like a wave, but there was no time to celebrate. The creature was still lunging toward him, and more were likely on the way. But now, there was hope. They had done it. They had called for help. Ethan grabbed Lyra's arm, pulling her to her feet. "We need to move," he shouted. "The cavalry's coming, but we're not out of this yet." With the communicator's signal successfully sent, the last phase of their escape had begun. It wasn't over, but for the first time since the crash, they had a fighting chance.